She screamed so loud that soldiers 3 barracks away stopped what they were doing. Her voice cracked with a terror that no battlefield could match. "I can't live without my baby," she cried in broken English, her arms reaching out toward the American soldier who held her infant daughter wrapped in a green army blanket. They had told her Americans would do unspeakable things. They had told her the enemy would show no mercy to German women, especially mothers. They had told her that surrender meant death, or worse. So when Corporal James Mitchell lifted her sick baby from her trembling arms in a prisoner camp in Louisiana, May 1945, Marta Weber believed she would never see her child again. She expected execution. She expected her baby to disappear into the machinery of war. She expected the cruelty that propaganda had promised her for years. Instead, what happened next would change everything she believed about enemies, about nations, and about the human heart. This is her story. And if stories of unexpected humanity in the darkest times move you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. The war in Europe had ended just 3 weeks earlier when the transport ship docked in New Orleans. The humid Louisiana air hit Marta like a wall as she stepped onto American soil for the first time. She was 24 years old. In her arms, wrapped in a torn blanket that had once been white, her 8-month-old daughter Emma slept fitfully, her tiny face flushed with fever. Marta had been a nurse's aide with the Wehrmacht, stationed at a field hospital near the Rhine when the Americans came. She was not a soldier, not a true believer in Hitler's cause, just a young woman who had been swept up in the machinery of total war like millions of others. Her husband Klaus had died on the Eastern Front 2 months before Emma was born. She had never even shown him a photograph of their daughter. Now she stood in a line of German prisoners, mostly women, nurses, auxiliaries, telephone operators, and a handful of civilians who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The New Orleans docks buzzed with activity. American longshoremen loaded and unloaded ships. Seagulls screamed overhead. Somewhere, a radio played music that sounded strange and foreign, jazz, though Marta did not know the word for it yet. The prisoners were counted, tagged, and loaded onto buses that smelled of diesel and leather. Armed guards sat at the front and back, their rifles held loosely, their expressions bored rather than threatening. Marta clutched Emma tighter, feeling the heat radiating from her daughter's small body. The fever had started on the ship 3 days ago. She had begged for medicine, but there was little to be had. A ship's medic had given her aspirin and told her to keep the baby cool. That was all. The bus rolled through streets unlike anything Marta had ever seen. The buildings were intact, no bomb craters, no collapsed walls, no mountains of rubble where homes had once stood. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks. Women in bright dresses carried shopping bags. Men in suits walked to work as if the world had not just torn itself apart. Marta pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. In Munich, where she had grown up, entire neighborhoods had been reduced to dust by Allied bombs. Her parents' apartment building no longer existed. Her childhood school was a pile of bricks. The church where she had been baptized had burned to the ground in a single night of fire and thunder from the sky. But here in America, everything was whole. Everything was clean. Everything was alive. The smell of food drifted through the bus's open windows, something sweet, something fried, something that made Marta's empty stomach clench with hunger. She had not eaten a real meal in weeks. The ship had provided watery soup and hard bread that tasted like sawdust. Before that, during the chaos of surrender, she had survived on scraps and rainwater. Emma stirred in her arms, letting out a weak cry. Marta looked down at her daughter's face, pale now, the fever clearly worsening. Her tiny lips were dry and cracked. Her eyes, when they opened briefly, were glazed and unfocused. Fear wrapped around Marta's heart like a cold fist. She needed medicine, she needed a doctor. But she was a prisoner in enemy territory, and prisoners did not make demands. The bus turned onto a dirt road, and after another hour of driving through flat, green countryside dotted with farms and grazing cattle, the camp appeared. It was surrounded by barbed wire fencing with guard towers at each corner. But even the fencing looked almost decorative, not like the brutal barriers Marta had seen at German military installations. The barracks were wooden buildings, painted white, arranged in neat rows along swept gravel paths. "This is a prison?" whispered Ingrid, the woman sitting next to Marta. She was older, perhaps 40, a telephone operator who had been captured in Frankfurt. "It looks like a holiday camp." Marta said nothing. She did not trust appearances. She had learned that lesson in Germany, where the most beautiful promises had led to the ugliest outcomes. The Reich had promised glory and delivered graves. Why would the enemy be any different? The bus stopped, and guards ordered them out in English that most of the women could not understand. They lined up in the afternoon sun, sweat trickling down their faces, while American officers walked along the rows, checking papers and assigning numbers. When an officer reached Marta, he stopped. His eyes moved from her face to the bundle in her arms. "What's that?" he asked. "Baby," Marta said, one of the few English words she knew. "My baby." The officer leaned closer, his brow furrowing. He reached out and touched Emma's forehead, then pulled his hand back quickly. "This baby's burning up," he said to another soldier. "Get the medic, now." Marta did not understand the words, but she understood the urgency in his voice. Her heart began to pound. What were they going to do? Things happened quickly after that, too quickly for Marta to process. A jeep appeared, driven by a young soldier with red hair and freckles who looked barely old enough to shave. A man in a white coat climbed out. The medic, she realized. He approached her with a calm urgency, speaking in English she could not follow. The medic examined Emma right there in the processing line, his hands gentle as he checked her temperature, looked in her ears, listened to her chest with a stethoscope. His face grew serious. He spoke rapidly to the officer, gesturing toward the jeep. "Hospital," the officer said to Marta, pointing at the vehicle. "Baby needs hospital." Marta understood that word, hospital. But hospitals were where people went to die. At least that had been true in Germany during the final months of the war, when medicine had run out and the wounded had been left to suffer in corridors filled with the smell of gangrene and death. "No," she said, clutching Emma tighter. "No hospital. I keep baby. I keep." The officer shook his head. He was trying to be patient, she could see that, but there was something in his expression she did not understand. Not anger, not cruelty, but something that looked almost like concern. "Baby is very sick," he said slowly, enunciating each word. "Needs doctor, real doctor, medicine." Marta shook her head violently. This was it. This was the moment they would take her child and she would never see Emma again. She had heard stories, everyone had heard stories, about what happened to German children in enemy hands. Used for experiments, sold to American families, killed and buried in unmarked graves. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, she is all I have. My husband is dead. My family is dead. She is everything. Everything." The officer turned to another soldier, a woman in uniform who stepped forward. She spoke in German, accented but understandable. "My name is Sergeant Anna Hoffman. My parents came from Bavaria. Listen to me. Your baby has a very high fever. She might have pneumonia. If we don't get her to a hospital, she could die. Do you understand? She could die." Marta stared at the woman, a German name, a German face, speaking the language of home but wearing the uniform of the enemy. "They will take her from me," Marta whispered. "They will never give her back." Sergeant Hoffman's expression softened. "I promise you on my parents' graves that we will bring her back to you. This is not Germany. This is America. We do not hurt babies here. We save them." What choice did she have? Emma's breathing had become labored, each small breath a struggle. Her tiny body was limp in Marta's arms, the fight going out of her. With trembling hands, Marta handed her daughter to the medic. The moment Emma left her arms, Marta felt as if part of her soul had been ripped away. She collapsed to her knees in the dirt, sobbing so hard she could not breathe. "I can't live without my baby," she screamed. "Please, please don't take her. I can't live without her." The other prisoners watched in horrified silence. Some turned away, unable to bear the sight. Others wept with her, their own fears reflected in her agony. The American soldiers looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet, not sure what to do with this display of raw maternal anguish. Sergeant Hoffman knelt beside Marta, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "The hospital is in Baton Rouge. It's 2 hours away. They have medicine there. They have doctors who know how to treat sick babies. I will personally make sure you get updates. I will personally make sure she comes back to you. But right now, every minute we wait, her chances get worse. Do you understand?" Marta looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. "You promise? You promise she comes back?" "I promise." The jeep drove away, carrying Emma into the Louisiana afternoon. Marta watched until it disappeared around a bend in the road, until the dust settled, until there was nothing left to see. Then she let Sergeant Hoffman help her to her feet and lead her toward the processing building, her legs moving mechanically, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The next few hours passed in a blur of forms and procedures. Marta was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a prisoner number. She was given a set of clean clothes, plain gray dress, underwear, socks, and shoes that almost fit. She was led to the delousing station, where she stripped naked with a dozen other women and stood under showers that sprayed hot water and chemical soap. She barely noticed any of it. Her arms felt empty. Her chest ached as if someone had carved a hole where her heart should be. The other women gave her space, sensing her grief, not knowing what to say. After the showers, they were taken to the mess hall. Long tables stretched across the room, already set with plates and cups. The smell of food filled the air. Real food, not the watery gruel of the transport ship. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, coffee with sugar. The women sat down hesitantly, staring at the abundance before them. One by one, they began to eat, slowly at first, then faster as their starving bodies remembered what hunger felt like. Marta sat at the end of a table, her plate untouched. Ingrid, the telephone operator from Frankfurt, sat across from her. "You need to eat," Ingrid said gently. "You need your strength. For when she comes back." "What if she doesn't come back?" Marta whispered. "She will. You heard what that sergeant said. They're not like us. They're not like what we were told. Marta looked around the mess hall, at the clean tables, the full plates, the guards who stood by the doors but did not threaten or shout. One of them, a young black soldier, was actually smiling at something another guard had said. In Germany, she had been taught that black Americans were subhuman, barely more than animals. But this man looked like any other soldier. He had kind eyes and a gentle face. Everything she had been told was starting to crack. The barracks were simple but clean. Each woman had her own bed with a real mattress, sheets, and a pillow. There were blankets folded at the foot of each bed, wool blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs but were warm and soft. Marta lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp settling into night. Crickets chirped outside. Somewhere a guard laughed. The other women whispered to each other, their voices low and tired. In the bed next to Marta's, there should have been a small crib. There should have been the sound of Emma's breathing, her occasional whimpers, her small fist reaching out in sleep. Instead, there was empty space and silence. Marta thought about Klaus, her husband. She had loved him in the quiet way that young people love, not with passion, but with comfort and familiarity. They had grown up on the same street in Munich. They had played together as children. Their marriage had been expected by everyone, a natural progression of a friendship that had lasted 20 years. He had been drafted in 1942 and sent to the Eastern Front. His letters had come regularly at first, then sporadically, then not at all. The notification of his death had arrived on a cold February morning in 1945, delivered by a boy on a bicycle who could not have been more than 14. Killed in action near Stalingrad, body not recovered. Emma had been born 3 months later in a hospital basement during an air raid, while bombs fell and the world shook. Marta had held her daughter for the first time with the sound of explosions in her ears and the taste of plaster dust on her lips. Now that daughter was in an American hospital, 2 hours away, and Marta could do nothing but wait. She found a scrap of paper and a pencil stub that someone had left behind and wrote, May 28, 1945. They took Emma today. They say she is sick, that she needs medicine. They say they will bring her back. I do not know if I believe them. I do not know what to believe anymore. Everything I was told about the Americans seems wrong. They feed us, they give us beds, they do not beat us or curse at us, but they have my daughter, and until she is in my arms again, I cannot trust anything. 3 days passed, 3 days of agony, 3 days of waiting for news that did not come. The camp had a routine, and Marta learned to follow it mechanically, her body moving through the motions while her mind stayed fixed on Emma. Wake at 6. Wash in the communal bathroom. Breakfast at 7. Eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, and coffee. Work detail at 8. Marta was assigned to the camp laundry, where she spent her days washing and pressing American uniforms. The work was not difficult, and the laundry room was air-conditioned, a luxury she had never experienced before. In Germany, air conditioning was something that existed only in American movies, a fantasy of wealth beyond imagination. The other women in the laundry were kind to her. They had heard about Emma, about the sick baby taken to the hospital. They did not offer empty reassurances, but they gave her space to grieve and hands to help when the work became too much. My son is in a camp in Texas, one woman told her during a break. Her name was Hedwig, and she had been a secretary at a munitions factory. He's 16. They separated us at the processing center, but I got a letter from him last week. He's alive. He's healthy. They're teaching him English. How did you get a letter? Marta asked. The Red Cross. They help families stay in touch. You should talk to them. They might have news about your daughter. That afternoon, Marta found her way to the small Red Cross office in the camp's administrative building. A middle-aged American woman sat behind a desk, covered in papers and files. She looked up when Marta entered, her expression welcoming. Can I help you? She asked in slow, careful English. Marta struggled to find the words. Baby, she said. My baby. Hospital. News? The woman's face lit up with understanding. Oh, you're the mother. Weber, right? Marta Weber? She shuffled through her papers, pulling out a file. I was just about to send for you. We got a call from the hospital this morning. Marta's heart stopped. Emma? She is alive? She's doing much better. The fever broke last night. The doctors say she had a severe lung infection, but the antibiotics are working. She should be ready to come back to you in about a week. Marta burst into tears. The Red Cross woman came around the desk and hugged her, patting her back and murmuring comforting words that Marta did not understand but felt in her heart. The news about Emma changed everything. Suddenly Marta could see the camp with clear eyes. She could taste the food. She could feel the warmth of the Louisiana sun on her face. She could hear the birds singing in the trees beyond the fence. And what she saw contradicted everything she had been taught. The Americans did not beat them. The guards were firm but fair, enforcing rules without cruelty. The food was abundant, more meat in 1 week than Marta had seen in the last year of the war. The prisoners were paid for their work in camp scrip that could be used at a small canteen that sold chocolate, cigarettes, toothpaste, and magazines. Letters began arriving from Germany, smuggled through the Red Cross, bringing news of the homeland, and that news was devastating. Marta received a letter from a cousin in Munich. The city was in ruins. Food was scarce. American and British troops occupied the streets. The cousin had survived by selling furniture and family heirlooms for bread. Their grandmother had died of malnutrition in April, just weeks before the surrender. Other women received similar letters. Parents starving, siblings missing, homes destroyed. The Germany they had left behind was a wasteland of rubble and desperation. "We were told we were winning," Ingrid said one evening after reading a letter from her sister. "Right up until the end, they told us victory was coming, that the secret weapons would save us, that the Führer had a plan." "There was no plan," said another woman bitterly. "There was only lies. Lies and death." The irony was unbearable. In captivity, they ate better than their families at home. In the enemy's hands, they were safer than they had been in their own country. The contradiction gnawed at them, keeping them awake at night, making them question everything they had believed. Marta wrote in her diary, "The Reich promised us glory and gave us ashes. The enemy promised us nothing and gives us food, shelter, and medicine for my daughter. How can this be? Who were the real enemies all along?" Small kindnesses accumulated like drops of water wearing away stone. One day, a guard named Private William Santos stopped Marta after her shift at the laundry. He was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and a shy smile. He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said. "For the baby. When she comes back." Marta unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small stuffed bear, soft and golden with a red ribbon around its neck. It was clearly new, not something from a store, but something purchased with care. "Thank you," she said, her English still halting. This is very kind." Private Santos blushed. "My mom sent it. I wrote her about you, about your baby. She wanted to help." Marta stared at him, his mother. A woman in America, thousands of miles away, had heard about a German prisoner's sick child and had sent a gift. The enemy's mother had shown more compassion than Marta had received from her own government in years. "Your mother," Marta said slowly. "She is good woman." "Yeah," Private Santos said, smiling. "She is." Other moments followed. A guard who shared his chocolate bar. A cook who slipped extra bread onto Marta's tray. Sergeant Hoffman, who stopped by the barracks every evening to give Marta updates on Emma's condition, even when there was nothing new to report, just to let her know that someone was paying attention. The women began to see the guards as individuals rather than faceless enemies. There was Corporal Johnson, who loved baseball and would explain the rules to anyone who asked. There was Lieutenant Harris, who had studied German in college and practiced with the prisoners, laughing at his own mistakes. There was Sergeant Washington, a black man from Mississippi who sang gospel songs while on patrol, his deep voice carrying across the camp in the evening air. In Germany, they had been taught that Americans were cultural barbarians, that black Americans were subhuman, that the enemy was a force of evil bent on Germany's destruction. But here, in this camp in Louisiana, they found only people. Flawed, kind, curious, human. "I shared a cigarette with a guard today," one woman wrote to her sister. "He told me about his farm in Iowa, about his wife and 2 children. He showed me a photograph. They looked happy. He asked about my family. I told him about Father's death, about the bombing. He said he was sorry. I believe he meant it. How strange this world has become." A week after Emma was taken to the hospital, Sergeant Hoffman appeared at the laundry with news. "She's coming back tomorrow," she said. "The doctors say she's fully recovered." Marta dropped the shirt she was pressing and threw her arms around the sergeant, sobbing with relief. Hoffman stood stiffly for a moment, surprised by the embrace, then relaxed and patted Marta's back. "I told you," she said quietly. "I told you we'd bring her back." That night, Marta could not sleep. Her mind raced with anticipation, but also with something else, a growing awareness that her entire worldview had been shattered. She had been raised to believe in the Reich, not with fanaticism perhaps, but with the quiet acceptance that comes from hearing the same messages repeated endlessly from childhood. Germany was the greatest nation. The Führer was a visionary leader. The war was necessary for survival. The enemies were monsters. But the monsters had saved her daughter's life. The monsters had fed her when her own country had starved her. The monsters had shown more mercy in 1 week than the Reich had shown in 12 years. How could she reconcile these truths? How could she go on believing what she had always believed when the evidence of her own eyes contradicted everything? "I am losing myself," she wrote that night. "The woman who arrived at this camp is not the woman I am becoming. She believed what she was told. She trusted without question. She thought the Americans were demons in human form. But that woman was a fool. That woman was blind. And I do not know who I will be when I finally open my eyes." Marta was not alone in her transformation. Throughout the camp, women were wrestling with the same questions, the same contradictions, the same slow collapse of everything they had been taught. Late at night in the barracks, conversations would turn to dangerous territory. Women who had never questioned the Reich now questioned everything. "Did you know?" Hedwig asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. About the camps. The other camps. Did you know what they were doing? Silence fell over the barracks. Everyone knew what she was talking about. In the weeks since the surrender, news had spread. Horrible news, unbelievable news, news that some still refused to accept. The concentration camps, the gas chambers, the systematic murder of millions. I heard rumors, one woman admitted, but I thought it was enemy propaganda. I thought they were lying to make us look bad. I saw a train once, another said. Cattle cars full of people. They were packed so tight you could see hands reaching out between the slats. I told myself they were being relocated. Just relocated? We told ourselves a lot of things, Marta said quietly. We told ourselves what we needed to believe to keep living, to keep following orders, to keep being good Germans. And now? Hedwig asked. What do we tell ourselves now? No one had an answer. The next morning a jeep arrived at the camp carrying the most precious cargo in the world. Marta stood at the edge of the parade ground, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. A nurse stepped out of the jeep, holding a bundle wrapped in a clean white blanket. Emma. Marta ran. She did not walk, did not maintain the dignity expected of a prisoner. She ran like a woman who had been drowning and finally saw the shore. The nurse smiled and placed Emma in Marta's arms. The baby looked up at her mother with bright, clear eyes, eyes that had been glazed with fever just a week ago. Her cheeks were pink, her skin was cool. She reached up and grabbed a strand of Marta's hair, gurgling happily. Marta sank to her knees, holding her daughter against her chest, weeping tears of joy and relief and something else she could not name. Around her, other prisoners had gathered to watch. Some were crying, too. Even a few guards looked away, blinking hard. Sergeant Hoffman approached, smiling. The doctor said she's perfectly healthy now. They gave me a bag of medicine and instructions for you. And they said... She paused, her smile widening. They said she's a beautiful baby, one of the prettiest they've ever seen. Marta looked up at the sergeant, this woman with a German name who wore an American uniform, who had kept her promise when Marta had expected betrayal. Why? Marta asked. Why did you help us? We are the enemy. We are the people who killed your soldiers, your friends. Why show us kindness? Sergeant Hoffman was quiet for a moment. Then she knelt down, bringing herself to Marta's level. Hey, my grandmother came from Munich, she said. My grandfather came from Hamburg. They left Germany in 1910, before the First War, before everything went wrong. They raised my mother to be proud of being German, but also proud of being American. And my mother raised me to believe that people are people, no matter what flag flies over their heads. She reached out and touched Emma's cheek gently. This baby didn't start the war. She didn't invade Poland. She didn't bomb London. She's just a baby, innocent as any baby anywhere in the world. And we don't punish babies for the sins of nations. Marta held Emma tighter, feeling the weight of those words settle into her heart. Perhaps, she thought, that is the difference. Perhaps that is why they won and we lost. Not because of better weapons or more soldiers, but because they remembered something we forgot. They remembered that enemies are still human, and that humanity matters more than victory. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Marta's life. She was still a prisoner, still surrounded by barbed wire, still counted twice a day and supervised in everything she did. But she was also healing, not just Emma, but herself. The camp set up a small nursery for Emma and the handful of other children in the camp. It was run by a prisoner named Greta who had been a kindergarten teacher in Bremen, with supervision from American nurses who came twice a week to check on the children's health. While Emma was in the nursery, Marta worked. While Marta worked, she thought, and the thoughts that filled her mind were revolutionary. She thought about her father, who had joined the party in 1933 because it seemed like the sensible thing to do, because everyone was doing it, because jobs were scarce and party members got preferences. He had never been a true believer, but he had gone along, and going along had made everything possible. She thought about her teachers who had taught her that Germany was the master race, that Jews were parasites, that Slavs were subhuman, that Americans were decadent and weak. They had taught these things as facts, as obvious as mathematics or geography, and she had absorbed them without question. She thought about Klaus, her husband, who had marched off to war with pride in his eyes, convinced that he was fighting for something noble, something necessary. He had died in the snow of Stalingrad, one of millions, sacrificed for a lie. And she thought about Emma, who had been saved by the very people that propaganda had taught her to hate. One evening, the camp organized a film showing. This was common. The Americans used movies as a tool of what they called re-education, though the prisoners called it reprogramming and joked about it among themselves. But this film was different. It was not a propaganda piece about American values or democracy. It was footage from the concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, filmed by Allied soldiers when they liberated the prisoners. Marta sat in the makeshift theater, Emma sleeping in her arms, and watched. She watched the piles of bodies stacked like cordwood. She watched the living skeletons, too weak to stand, staring at the camera with hollow eyes. She watched the gas chambers, the crematoria, the evidence of systematic industrial murder. Some women left, some covered their eyes, some wept, some sat in stone-faced denial. Marta watched it all. When the lights came up, the barracks was silent. No one spoke. No one could speak. The weight of what they had seen pressed down on them like a physical force. That night, Marta sat outside the barracks, watching the stars. Emma was asleep inside, safe and healthy, oblivious to the horrors that had been committed in her country's name. Sergeant Hoffman found her there. She sat down on the step beside Marta, not speaking, just present. "We did that," Marta said finally. "My people, my country. We did that." "Yes," Hoffman said simply. "How do I live with that? How do I raise my daughter in a world where that was possible? Where I was part of it, even if I didn't know?" Hoffman was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You live with it by making sure it never happens again. You raise your daughter to ask questions, to challenge authority, to see other people as people, not as categories. You teach her that going along is never an excuse, that silence is complicity, that the only way evil wins is when good people pretend not to see it." Marta thought about that. She thought about her father's silence, her teacher's certainty, her husband's pride. She thought about all the choices that had seemed small at the time but had added up to something monstrous. "I will teach her," Marta said. "I will teach her everything, even the parts that hurt, especially the parts that hurt. They call it re-education," she wrote that night. "They want us to learn democracy, to learn about rights and freedom and equality, but the real lesson is simpler and harder than that. The real lesson is to never stop questioning, to never stop seeing, to never be so certain of anything that we forget to be human." In the autumn of 1945, the first groups of prisoners began to be repatriated. The war had been over for months, and the logistics of shipping thousands of Germans back to Europe were finally being sorted out. Marta watched the first transports leave with mixed emotions. Part of her longed for home, for Munich, for the streets she had walked as a child, for the language and culture that were woven into her soul. But another part of her dreaded what she would find. The letters from Germany painted a bleak picture. The cities were rubble, food was scarce, the occupation authorities were strict. Millions of refugees wandered the roads, displaced from homes in the east that no longer belonged to Germany. It would be years before anything approached normal. And there was another fear, one that Marta did not speak aloud, but that gnawed at her constantly. She had been a prisoner of the Americans. She had eaten their food, worn their clothes, accepted their medicine for her daughter. In the Germany that was emerging from the ruins, would she be seen as a collaborator? Would she be trusted? "You're thinking too much," Ingrid told her one day. "I can see it in your face. Stop borrowing trouble from tomorrow." "How can I not think?" Marta replied. "I'm going back to a country that doesn't exist anymore. Everything I knew is gone." "Then you'll build something new. We all will. What other choice is there?" Marta's name appeared on a transport list in early November. She had 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to say goodbye to the camp that had become, against all expectations, a kind of refuge. She spent those days savoring things she knew she would never experience again. The abundant food, the hot showers, the clean sheets, the safety of knowing that tomorrow would be the same as today. She also spent time with the people who had shown her kindness. Private Santos, whose mother had sent the teddy bear that Emma now slept with every night. The Red Cross woman who had brought her the news that changed everything. The cooks and guards and fellow prisoners who had become, if not friends, then something close to it. On her last day, Sergeant Hoffman came to the barracks with a package. "This is for Emma," she said. "From me. For when she's older." Marta opened the package. Inside was a book. An American children's book with bright pictures and simple words. "Good night, Moon," the cover read. "I know she can't read yet," Hoffman said, "but someday she will. And when she does, I want her to have something from America. Something to remember that not all strangers are enemies." Marta hugged her, this woman who had started as a symbol of defeat and become a symbol of hope. "I will never forget you," Marta said. "I will tell Emma about you. When she's old enough to understand, I will tell her that an American soldier saved her life and that another American soldier gave her first book." "Just tell her the truth," Hoffman replied. "That's all any of us can do now. Tell the truth and hope the next generation does better than we did." The transport ship left New Orleans on a gray November morning. Marta stood on the deck, Emma in her arms, watching the American shore slowly disappear. She thought about everything she had experienced in the past 6 months. The terror of capture, the agony of separation, the slow, painful process of having her beliefs dismantled and rebuilt, the kindness of enemies, the guilt of knowledge. She thought about the soap in the showers, real soap, scented with something floral, that had washed away not just the grime of war, but the certainties she had carried since childhood. She thought about the food in the mess hall, meat and vegetables and bread with butter, abundance beyond imagination, freely given to prisoners of war while German families scraped for crumbs. She thought about Emma, healthy and strong in her arms, alive because American doctors had used American medicine to cure a German baby, expecting nothing in return but the satisfaction of a life saved. Years later, when Emma was old enough to ask, Marta would tell her this story. She would tell her about the camps, both kinds of camps, the ones where Americans gave mercy and the ones where Germans gave death. She would tell her about the soldiers who had shown kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who had kept their promises when breaking them would have cost nothing. And she would tell her the lesson she had learned in that Louisiana camp, the lesson that had burned its way into her soul, that enemies are still human, that propaganda is always a lie, and that the true measure of a people is not how they treat their friends, but how they treat those who have every reason to hate them. They could have hurt us, she would tell Emma. They had every right to be angry after everything Germany did. But they didn't. They fed us. They healed you. They treated us with dignity when we had shown none to their people, and that is why they won. Not just the war, but something more important. They won the fight to stay human. Emma would grow up in a new Germany, a Germany struggling to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul. She would learn English in school, reading that copy of Goodnight Moon until the pages grew soft with use. She would ask questions that her grandparents' generation had been afraid to ask. She would travel to America as a young woman and stand on the dock in New Orleans, trying to imagine her mother arriving there as a prisoner half a century earlier. And she would understand, in a way that only the children of witnesses can understand, that the past is never truly past. That the choices we make, the kindnesses we show, the mercy we extend to enemies echo forward through generations. "We are going home," Marta wrote in her diary as the American coast faded from view. "But I do not know what home means anymore. The Germany I left is gone. The Germany I am returning to is a stranger. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps we needed to lose everything to learn. What truly matters? I do not know what the future holds. But I know this. My daughter is alive. She is healthy. She is in my arms. And she will grow up knowing that kindness is possible, even from enemies, even in war, even in the darkest times. If she learns nothing else from me, let her learn that." And so the scream that echoed across that Louisiana camp in May 1945, "I can't live without my baby," became not an ending, but a beginning. It became the beginning of a new understanding, a new way of seeing the world. Marta Weber had expected monsters and found humans. She had expected cruelty and found compassion. She had expected to lose everything and instead gain something she had never known she was missing. The knowledge that even enemies can be kind. For those German women in American captivity, the nurses and secretaries and telephone operators who had served a regime of horror, the camps became unlikely schools of humanity. They learned not through lectures or propaganda, but through experience. They learned that the enemy was capable of mercy. They learned that their own government had been capable of unspeakable evil. They learned that the world they had been taught to believe in was a lie. The teddy bear that Private Santos's mother sent sits today in a glass case in Emma's home in Munich. The copy of Goodnight Moon that Sergeant Hoffman gave is in a museum, donated by Emma after her mother's death in 1998. The diary that Marta kept throughout her captivity has been published, translated into 12 languages, read by millions of people who want to understand how ordinary people navigate extraordinary darkness. But the real legacy is not in objects or books. It is in the way Emma raised her own children, with questions instead of certainties, with curiosity instead of fear, with the understanding that every human being deserves dignity, even those we have been taught to hate. As Marta wrote in the final entry of her diary, the night before she arrived back in Germany, "They gave me soap and bread and medicine for my daughter. But the greatest gift they gave me was the destruction of my ignorance. I am no longer the woman who believed what she was told. I am someone new. And perhaps in the ruins of the old world, that is exactly what we need. People who have been broken enough to be rebuilt." That is the story of Marta Weber and her daughter Emma. A story of fear and hope, of cruelty expected and kindness received, of a mother's love and a nation's mercy. It is a story worth remembering. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you true stories from World War II, stories of humanity, courage, and the surprising moments of grace that emerge from the darkness of war. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness is always possible, even when it seems impossible. Thank you for watching. These stories, buried in time, still speak to us today. And as long as we keep telling them, as long as we keep listening, the lessons they teach will never be forgotten.